All right. Well, thanks very much for coming tonight. My name is Kerri O'Shaughnessey, and I'm a riparian specialist with Cows and Fish, also known as the Riparian Management Society. We are a not-for-profit organization that works with producers, agriculture producers, communities, and other organizations and agencies that have an interest in watersheds and how their lands and waters are connected. So our mission is to promote healthy landscapes by fostering riparian stewardship. And essentially what that involves is bringing information to those that are on the landscape making decisions. And we try to inform people with practical experience, scientific information, and be a bridge between all the different things that can be part of making land use decisions. So part of what we do is work directly with individual producers, and so bringing examples and stories of what's been working and what's maybe not working so well with agricultural practices in terms of keeping riparian areas healthy, and how those riparian management strategies fit into the overall operation. Because if you've got a spring or you've got a seep, that is a riparian area, because it's an area that is influenced by water and probably has different plants that are growing there than some of the other parts. You can also have riparian areas around larger streams and rivers, and lakes and wetlands also. So they're the transition zones between the open water and the uplands, and the vegetation there is different because of that influence of water, and the soils are different as well. So riparian areas are diverse. So depending on where you are, in a particular area, you may have a riparian area that's quite wide, or you may have an area that is very narrow because you're in a confined type of a valley, or you may be on a lakeshore where wave action is the interaction into that riparian zone. And you need unique vegetation in that riparian zone to help protect against erosion, to help filter water, and to store water in the ground, and also provide habitat for wildlife of all different kinds, including domestic livestock. And it also helps to sub-irrigate the ground, these riparian zones, to support crop growth. So if we think about these riparian areas, they're just typically a small part of the overall landscape that are influenced by this water, but they do some very important things for us. So building and maintaining banks and shorelines by trapping and storing sediment is one way to help with water quality. So if water is able to flow over plants that have deep binding roots, that have good structure, different structural layers, that water is going to ultimately be cleaner by the time it runs through there, because it will have slowed down, and some of that sediment that may be carrying nutrients will have settled out and is now on the land where it can be used by the plants and not in the water. Another element about these riparian areas, these floodplains and shorelines, is they help to recharge aquifers and groundwater. That helps with flood mitigation, drought mitigation. If we have healthy riparian lands, again with those different plants, as well as soils that can absorb water, hold it in the ground, that's going to reduce flood peaks and also keep water in the soil longer to be released in drier times and in drier years. And being able to get out onto a floodplain, particularly in a stream and river situation, and sometimes in lakes as well, that energy that water has when it's moving, if it can get out onto a wider area, it's going to slow down, reduce the horsepower that has, reduce that erosive energy. And then kind of the third element that these riparian areas help with are primary productivity, including forage for livestock. Shelter would come into that as well. Maintaining just biodiversity in general. The diversity of plants that we find in riparian areas is really high, particularly when they're healthy, and also the number of animals that use these areas. So, 80% of all of our wildlife and 100% of our fish are going to rely on a riparian area that is flowing or non-flowing at some point in time. And then the other element is carbon sequestration. So we're thinking about how we manage these riparian areas and incorporate them into, whether it's a grazing operation or even an urban situation. If we took grazing out of this title, you could have essentially just riparian management principles, and just how you do it just would shift a little bit differently. So the first principle is balancing animal demand with available forage supply. So this is, do you have enough growth and forage to meet the demand that you need for the animals by being able to leave something left, so having some carryover. Providing effective rest after grazing, and these are in quotes again because of that use. You know, you could put after walking all the dogs on the lake shore, for example. Same idea. Do you have the ability to give those plants some time, and those soils, some time to recover and rest after that use? Avoiding and minimizing the grazing or the use during fragile or vulnerable times. So for riparian areas, that's typically going to be spring, when soils are wet after snowmelt. It could also be a continuous wet situation. You know, if you have a spring or a seep that is constantly wet, it may be something that you want to protect in order to keep the animals away from that area. Then the other piece with riparian zones, particularly in this part of the world, is they tend to grow trees and shrubs really well. So, and they can be pretty tasty to a lot of livestock. So being able to use these riparian zones maybe later in the summer, as opposed to winter and fall when those woody plants would have more nutrition than some of the grasses would. And then the last thing is, or the other fourth principle is about distributing livestock. So this is thinking about tools that you can use to take the pressure off of that riparian zone. So again, whether it's a shoreline or a floodplain or the area around a seep or a spring, having tools in place to be able to sort of incorporate the other principles is helpful. So fencing can be a tool, off-stream watering systems can be a tool where you bring the water to the animal, having salt and mineral, depending on where you do that, rotational grazing, those sorts of things. The other piece, if we're thinking about crops and forages, that could be creating a buffer around your riparian area so that you leave a zone that is, can just be natural between your crop and your land, your water area. It could also be a pollinator habitat. It could be, again, just a natural area or even a perennial coverage, perennial forage area, seeded to grasses or tame, something like that, that can filter and capture some of those pesticides that may be running off that landscape in a heavy rain, for example. So there are some funding opportunities available out there to support some of these different agricultural practices. And one of the ones that is currently not accepting applications right now, but will be again in the new year, is the Resilient Agricultural Landscape Program, or RALP. And it's funded by the Government of Canada and Alberta through the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership. Now the key with this one is that it does require an environmental farm plan. So if you don't have one of those, you have to complete it by the end of the term of the project, which is 3 years. So, and if you have an old one, I believe it's over 10 years old, you would want to update that and get that done. Local counties or municipal districts or watershed groups like Mighty Peace Watershed Alliance sometimes have dollars and funding that can support ag producers in putting in some of these programs. If you're in a community that has an ALICE program, which used to stand for Alternative Land Use Services, there's an element of cost share for implementation of these programs, as well as an annual payment for acres that are shifted into, say you've been grazing right up to the channel, the stream channel, for example, you want to shift that to putting in an off-stream watering system. The area of that riparian zone that is now used or is now rested can get an annual payment, typically a small annual payment for 5 years. And lastly, cows and fish. We have expertise that we can bring right onto farm. We can come into community groups, communities, and do presentations like we're doing today. We could do a field day, and we also sometimes do have funding to support ag producers doing projects, but that is always funder dependent. So just a little bit more about RALP. There's a really good website there for people to check out with a lot more details, but there's a variety of funding options available there. Some of the grazing activities that I mentioned are included, as well as things like eco buffers, pollinators, habitat and crop management changes. And there's some contact information down at the bottom. So with that, thank these members and supporters.